Why don't we get started? Thank you all for attending. My name is Ken Berlin. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Prior to joining the Council, I was president and CEO of the Climate Reality Project, the group formed by former Vice President Al Gore, and of which he is chairman. And I spent most of my career working as an environmental and climate change lawyer, ending at the firm of Skadden Arps. I'd like to begin by introducing the panelists here today. We have a very distinguished panel. First, the Right Honorable Charles Hendry. He works extensively across the energy sector, focusing on the transition to net zero. He is a former Minister of Energy and Climate Change in the UK from 2010 to 2012, and he is now a professor at the University of Edinburgh. Great, thanks. Next, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky is a senior fellow at Harvard University's Belker Center and is vice chair of the Socraft Center at the Atlantic Council. A career spanning 30 years in the U.S. government. She was Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs from 2001 to 2009 and was the chief U.S. climate negotiator for 8 years during that time period. Neil Brown at the end of the table is works the intersection of finance and geopolitics, investing in climate, clean energy, and infrastructure at the firm of KKR, Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. And Ana Palacio is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain from 2002 to 2004. She's also a former vice president and general counsel at the World Bank Group, and she's done many, many other things during her career. So I welcome all of you to the event. In this session, we're going to discuss the interesting and immensely important subject of climate diplomacy. Arresting the climate crisis will require virtually every nation in the world to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and it will require rich countries to help poor countries to adapt to and to economically recover from the damage being done and that will be done in the future from climate change. But this must happen in a world in which geopolitical tensions are getting worse, and in which energy crisis and war in Europe that you've been hearing about all day today is complicating the whole energy system and making it and creating energy shortages and creating a whole new series of tensions we have to deal with over the next 2 years. On the positive side, climate negotiations are taking place in the context of an international agreement signed by almost every country in the world, the Paris Climate Agreement. Under that agreement, the countries meet regularly. There's an annual meeting of the parties, so they're getting together all the time to discuss and work on these issues. It is also taking place in a context where I think almost every country in the world recognizes that climate change is a real threat, and most think that urgent action is necessary to address the crisis. Yet, the transition to a new clean energy system and addressing the damage from climate change are extremely difficult to solve. The issues are extremely difficult to solve and on which to reach consensus. Thus, the task of climate diplomats is to overcome the general geopolitical divisions, deepen the consensus to take action on these issues, to at a minimum develop actions and programs that address the climate crisis, and wherever possible, to work together to address these issues. Our panelists today are experts in all these issues and on the institutions and on the limitations and tensions underlying these issues and collective action. So let me begin by asking Charles a question. Could you tell us your views on how serious the implications are of these broader geopolitical tensions on the ability of countries to work together to address the climate issue? And could you give us a few examples of how countries can work together and what they've been doing to overcome these limitations?
Ken, thank you very much indeed. And first of all, to say that we can be knocked off course, but it's our job as people involved in these wider aspects of these negotiations to make sure we're not. And we heard very clearly from Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber this morning of the very clear ambition that they have here in the UAE for how COP will work. And what we need to recognize is the work for a successful COP isn't done in those 2 weeks in November and December. It starts now. In fact, it started straight after Sharm el-Sheikh. And it'll go right the way through this year, and then it will continue right the way through next year as well. COP is merely a milestone in a continuing process. And that the success of a COP depends on how those alliances, how those discussions are handled leading up to it, and which make it go well, and to determine how that happens. I think I'll make a number of points about how one most effectively delivers a good outcome. First of all, it's about alliances. I think the UAE is in a remarkably strong position to build those alliances. There are countries which the United States or the UK would find it more difficult to engage with for historical reasons than the UAE would. And they will be able to help to build that broad coalition, and recognizing that partly because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is a greater recognition in many parts of the world that we need to decarbonize, we need to do it more quickly, we need to do it more effectively, because decarbonized solutions are not now just good for the planet, they're good for security because they make us less dependent on imported gas, and that they're good for affordability as well. So building associations is the first part. Secondly, it means bringing in businesses, it means bringing in civil society, it means bringing in the financiers. Because that ensures that in the course of those discussions and the run up to them, you've got people who say, look, we have solutions. We know what we need to do, we know how we can accelerate it, and we know how to pay for it. And it's that sense of optimism which I think is incredibly important in delivering a successful outcome. And the third thing I think is to recognize is that there is no one size fits all. Each country needs different solutions which reflect their geopolitical position and their external and internal interests. If we try to put them into narrow boxes, it will fail. But so for the big oil and gas producers, if they will sign up to a strict target to stop methane emissions by 2030, that would be a massive win for the planet, for climate. And so that we've got to find ways of ensuring that not everybody thinks it's all about electric vehicles and wind turbines and solar panels and nuclear, but each country has a different way of being able to make their contribution towards a successful COP. Everything which I heard from His Excellency this morning makes me convinced that that's the way they're going to go about it. They're keen to listen, they're keen to engage, and I think that they're setting exactly the right approach for making this work.
Great, thank you. Because this is the first question, I'm going to ask each panelist to give their views on it. Paula, can you respond also?
To the same question?
Yes, same question.
I would first tend to agree with what Charles laid out, because what you laid out was that this particular agenda, and as we very well listened to Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, who gave an outstanding speech, I think, this morning, a very inspirational, a very action-oriented, targeted speech. I think that that demonstrated a real commitment to move forward with a very precise agenda. But where I might diverge is what happens in terms of the great powers. And here in this case, not the United States, but I look at in this context what position Russia will take in this, what position China will take in this. Because if you look at Sharm el-Sheikh, by the way, The Economist wrote a piece after Sharm el-Sheikh, and it was kind of an interesting piece. On one hand, it said that there seemed to be a kind of thawing of the tension between the US and China. But then in the same article, it also said that there were two complicating factors. The one that China still remains as part of the G77. And countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati, small island states, you know, they actually in past COPs have raised the question, why is China still attached to the group of 77? If it's a major stakeholder, why is it not actually a major stakeholder also in the context of the COP? But there was a second more important issue, and that was that there was at Sharm el-Sheikh actually 150 countries had pledged to cut methane gases, methane emissions, and China did not join in that. And there was another, and that was most significantly, and that's related to the G77 grouping, countries pledge financial aid. And so China remains to the side. So when you look at this mix, I think it's problematic. So the question will be, I think you're right about, UAE being well positioned to use its alliances to advance the agenda. But the question remains, what will individual countries do in the end, like China? And one more, and I'll end on this note in answer to the question. I look at Russia. It's instructive to me. When I was in government, I went to 3 Arctic Council meetings. And these meetings were very, very engaged on issues relevant to climate change and the impact that it had, particularly on the very affected indigenous communities. Here, because of the invasion, they've taken out Russia, and it's come a bit to a halt. So, cooperation, in some cases, I think will go forward, but I also think that we need to have our eyes wide open as to what some of the realities are.
Yeah, could I ask you a follow-up question on China? Obviously, there are deep tensions between the United States and China and on this issue. On the other hand, both countries are making progress to address the climate crisis. The United States just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which makes hundreds of billions of dollars available to renewable energy. And China, we've just learned, people think they are going to reach their 2030 targets for renewable energy under the Paris Climate Agreement in 2025. This means both are taking action. Is there a way, even though they're not cooperating directly, is there a way to get them to at least go down the path of each making significant reductions? So they're doing China is doing what it should be doing under this, and what it would be doing even if there was more formal cooperation on it.
But by the way, you're right in making that statement, because individually, both countries are taking action. And also, I think back at the time when I was involved with the COPs, actually, that was a challenge. We weren't always seeing that. And, there was the period where the U.S. was the world's greatest emitter, then China, and, now both are, front and center. So, yes, you're right. The question remains, in the COP, can they come together in such a way, and it doesn't have to be that it's just Russia and China, U.S. and China, but, come together in a collective way as part of a collective effort, and that goes to Charles' point about alliances, groupings. That may be a better way forward. But can I use this moment just to inject a national security point and something about the Biden administration put forward, which I think is important to state here? And that is, first, the Biden administration late last year released its national security strategy document. And the first point is that it did restate the fact that we are in this era of great power competition. And it cited China and Russia, and that we need to be cognizant of that. And what is it about? It's about the mutual goal on their part, of diminishing U.S. power and influence worldwide. And at the same time, trying to fragment the U.S. relations with its alliances and with its partners, the very thing that you mentioned, wreaking havoc there. But this is the second part, which I think is worth stating and goes to your question. The strategy document also distinguished itself by saying that it should not just be only about competition, but also the U.S. should look for ways of cooperation. Now, the cooperation may be individually, or it could be in tandem with others. And to cite the one that they particularly highlighted was with the Pacific Island states. They've held a summit and have brought in the Pacific Island states. And I think the good news here is the U.S. wasn't so engaged on adaptation strategies there. They've been very desirous in that part of the world of greater engagement. But guess who is involved? China. But China hasn't been actually providing the kind of assistance that's needed. So you could view that initiative as a bit challenging to China, but who knows? Will there be some kind of cooperation that will come out of that? I'm not holding my breath at this time, but I'm glad for the initiative on the part of the administration.
Great, thank you. Anna, could you, again, go back to the initial question, which is what are the impact of the geopolitical tensions on climate negotiations? And you can also respond and talk about China if you want to also.
Well, allow me just to elaborate a bit on what is the space for diplomacy. The space for diplomacy is between dogma, ideology that just courses positions, and transactionalism. This is the space that we have. So with this, we have to go into this climate issue with one first. And I'm very happy that here today have heard decarbonization many times, not greening, because greening is the ideologization of the clear objective. And you're absolutely right that there is an awareness, and that this is a global awareness about the need to decarbonize, and that everything that would decarbonize is welcome. And this, I think, is the first, and this is what the mantra of this approach to diplomacy. The second, and going to your issue, the second need in diplomacy is trust, building trust. And how are we in these issues building trust? Is that we cannot decouple this COP with what's happening in the world, and this is your question. But I think that it's important what's happening in the world, and what's happening in the world is that we have a big undermining of the global rules-based order. And this is the background of the China-US tension is that. And we have to take this aspect into account. And there we see China is in every aspect the smooth operator. I mean, Paula was mentioning belonging to the 77. China has pushed forward the loss and damage fund, but not accepted to participate, which is typical of the approach of China. China has gone from 2017 just putting herself in the front row on cooperation, on diplomacy, to a 2020 Xi Jinping speech that is much more cautious on this idea of just going forward on themselves. Then we have the European Union. We in the European Union, we are the standard bearers of rules. And I think that we have been effective, but we have to get into a more realistic. Last but not least, we need the United States to lead. And frankly, this is the best news of the last year, is that the United States has decided to go for it. And when the machinery of the United States, starting by the government, just goes into one area, well, things happen. And this is what we are seeing. So we may, from Europe, just think about, what about the IRA? You know what? We need this change to happen. We need this force to go there. Last but not least, let's not forget what is behind all this. It's values. I mean, I want the United States to lead because I want to contest the charter that we saw in the International Energy Agency yesterday about where do all the components, all the process of lithium or cobalt or everything today, and all the elements of the renewable technology, they mostly come from China. We are in the hands of China, and we know how these positions could be weaponized. Europe learned about just being dependent on gas from Russia, especially, I would say, Germany. Spain, we had a flotilla of LNG terminals built in the 80s and the 90s that just has us in a safer position. But let's speak about Europe in general. What we don't want is that the world that abides by the rules-based order is at a certain moment dependent, absolutely dependent on China. And I think that this is a panorama that if the toolkit, if you are if you want diplomacy, you have to go with this toolkit. I think that in this context, it's very important to remember that it's not just in Sharm el-Sheikh that African countries just went openly in contestation. We have heard from Carlos Pascual, we have promised, we have pledged, we haven't delivered. There is a lack of trust, and they are right. There is a lack of trust. And we may just tell them, you know what, you will have the privilege to go directly to renewable just energy. A Mozambican friend of mine always tell me, Anna, we want to decarbonize, but let us carbonize a little bit before. And I think that these are the realistic elements that anyone that is involved in just climate diplomacy has to take into account.
Can I ask you a little bit more about dogma? Because I think understanding what is and isn't dogma is really probably very important, both from diplomacy and other standpoints. It strikes me there are two fundamental kinds of dogma in the climate area. The first is scientific. In other words, we have to address this issue, otherwise we're going to have a crisis. We've got to do it at some point. I mean, when I say dogma, there's obviously a little disagreement, but the dogma is basically we have to hold this as close to 1.5 degrees centigrade as we can, and and go from there. And at some point we run into a situation we can't reverse. The second kind of dogma I can think of is implementation dogma. Sort of saying we have to decarbonize tomorrow without looking at the realities of the world. But how do you define dogma?
Well, allow me to just disagree. I think that what we have is a consensus. That is a paradigm just established by scientists. We need to address a problem. The problem is here and it's real. And fortunately, and this is the first thing that came out of Paris, is that there is a human awareness about this. It's true in Africa, in Latin America, everywhere in the world that we have an issue. We have to confront it. The way we confront it is different. What do we call a dogma? A dogma is the negationist. That's a dogma, because it's faith. They say, no, without anything. I believe that the man-made doesn't have such an influence. And on the opposite side, and this is, I think, among the many things that the European Union has done right, and being on the front line since 94 at least, Kyoto, the European Union has been in implementing, in just going forward with this. But the issue is that we have transformed this decarbonization effort, this regulation of the decarbonization effort, into a dogma based on a leap of faith on that technologies will happen and that these technologies will allow us to be green. I'm on a board of a company that is related with gas. We were stranded assets in European Union terms until the invasion of Ukraine. We were stranded assets. This was the approach of the very short future. We have listened to this idea that the Europeans do not want to commit beyond 3 years. And this is based on a leap of faith that we will have enough hydrogen, that we will have enough storage. I think that we need to keep the betting of the Europeans. We need to keep this going forward, the European Union, but honestly, at the same time, we have to be a bit more, bit less dogmatic, we cannot just go on issues that affect our societies on leaps of faith, that something will happen that we will have there to be ready to. In fact, the European Union has changed. As you know now, gas is green, which is another contradiction. Gas is many things. It's decarbonized, it's not green. And nuclear, well, that was a no-no, now it's green through the back door. No, we have to accept that nuclear decarbonizes. Then we need to review our dogmatic positions pervasive in the European Union and frankly that gas is not green, but is less polluting than others. And just go on methane, on low-hanging fruits that are lost because of the dogma.
Okay. All right. Neil, can I have your views on all this?
Sure. I'll try to go. Can you hear me okay? No, not yet? Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Sorry. It's always hard to follow Anna. She says everything, and then you add Paula and Charles on top of it. I feel like I should have some joke about, like, 3 diplomats and a banker walk into a bar. But let me just thank Atlantic Council for having me, and also our hosts at Abu Dhabi, who I know we all thank just across the Emirate. They're always such great hosts for us. I think we have to be clear-eyed about the environment that climate diplomacy is happening in. This is probably the most complex geopolitical environment that has ever existed. Not necessarily the most dangerous, but the most complex. I think that falls into 3 general categories. First, geopolitical competition, which Ken and everybody has talked about. Competition that we're desperate to stop from turning into confrontation between the US and China, but not just the US, EU, Japan, to some extent Korea, Australia, et cetera, but also competition between friends. Because the US, EU, all of those countries, all of those friends want to have a commanding position in the economy of the future, which is a clean economy. Hence, all of the brouhaha over the IRA and our friends in Europe being irate. That's number 1. Number 2 is we are still living in a populist moment. We maybe got a little reprieve from that in Europe as people are focused on more important things. But remember, Macron won the election, but so did the far right. Biggest take ever. We now have the most far-right president, or excuse me, prime minister since the Second World War in Italy. Similar stories we've seen over the last years in Europe, most of Latin America, now populist. By the way, populist can be left or right, as we know in the United States with President Trump. What that leads is to a more inward-looking policy set. Harder, pulls against international solutions. And then, of course, the third area, transnational threats. Climate change being the biggest, also non-proliferation, also pandemics, et cetera. A set of problems that demands international solutions at a time that, because of competition and because of populism, solutions are harder to find. Where does that, so what does that mean for climate diplomacy? We can't look back, right? Like, we can't keep trying to do the same things that we've done for years. Climate diplomacy has to adapt to the new future. Some things we can cooperate on, some things we will compete on, and we need to figure out how we bring the rest of the world to the table. I'm so happy that the loss and damage discussion is happening. Regardless of what you think of the contents, finally, parts of the world that haven't really been at the table are a central part of the discussion. Now, I think I agree completely with Charles and what he said, that I think that UAE, I'm very happy that the UAE is leading this COP process. And that's for 3 reasons. One, he said, well, bridging divides between the so-called Western world and China, even Russia, and even more importantly, between North and South, where a country like the US and much of Western Europe doesn't have a lot of credibility given the history, both political, colonial history, but also history of emissions. I think that's really important. I think the second thing is that we have to have oil and gas at the table, and this is one of the most important oil and gas companies in the world with ADNOC. Most important not just for volumes today, but because they have one of the lowest lifting costs in the world, so they're going to be important until there's the end of oil. And then the third is that any of us who have had the privilege to work here in Abu Dhabi, myself invest here, know that when the Emiratis put their mind to something and they announce a goal, they get it done. And that will just be my final point on the climate diplomacy question that you started with, which is that COP28, like 27, like 26, et cetera, is just the beginning. What we really have to focus on is action. It's an important framework, but like one of our founders at KKR says, basically any fool with a big enough checkbook can buy a company. How do you actually drive value? So unfortunately, it doesn't just take a checkbook to get an agreement at COP, although that's helpful. But the same principle applies. Whatever's agreed to there, is it actually going to bring private capital off the sidelines? And so I am pretty encouraged. I think, on this China point, let me just say two quick things. It's so complex. One of the areas that has to happen is we have to recognize, I think Anna said well, there is competition on climate between the US and China, US et al. And China. What we have to do is ring fence the areas within the climate space where we will agree with China to have competition and where it doesn't matter. Because right now, that's not defined. And I give the Biden administration credit that they're trying to do that in other areas, like in semiconductors. But it hasn't yet happened in China. So you have clean energy technology on the White House sensitive and emerging technology list. Same was true in the Trump administration. What the heck is clean energy technology? As one of the largest private investors in the world, what am I supposed to do with that? Are solar panels clean energy technology that we're sensitive about? Or is it really innovative stuff? We have to have more clarity so that you can get capital moving. The second thing is, for the emerging world, we're moving more and more towards competition. Again, G7 announcement by US, what is it, IPEE, no. The Asia Pacific announcement, there's so many acronyms these days. We're moving again towards competition with China for energy and critical infrastructure projects around the world. There are very real reasons why certain Chinese investments are very detrimental in those countries. This is an important topic, but this is an area we should be cooperating. We should be trying to come to common standards, because for climate reasons, like economic development reasons, we need that investment. What we want is for it to be quality investment. We don't want it to destroy credit profiles. We don't want it to foment corruption. That needs to be the trajectory. I know there are some people in this administration, like the administration before it, who also believe that, but at the moment, it's very combative. We're going to try to beat China at that game, and that's a loser for the climate.
Great, thank you. I'm going to come back to one or two things you said in a minute, but Charles, do you have any comments on what's been said since you spoke, since it was quite a while ago?
Yes, so quite a few. So can I first of all pick up on Neil's point about the importance of having the oil and gas companies involved? There should be a very clear message to the oil and gas companies that this is their last best chance to play an active role in the COP processes. If they don't do that this year, if they don't give it their very best shot, then they will be frozen out in the future. This is the chance for the industry to show that it can bring solutions and it can help to accelerate change. And so I think bringing them in a way that we didn't actually do in Glasgow, but I think is exactly the right thing to do. But they should be under no illusions. This is not them getting off a hook. This is them now committing to being part of the process and helping to drive that forward. I think on China, that China has built more wind turbines this year, I think last year, than the rest of the world combined. I think it's installed more solar than the rest of the world combined. So China is investing in low-carbon technologies in a way that is quite breathtaking. And we need to recognize that. But it's also for China's benefit. They're not doing it, I think, as much for the climate as that they want to see this as an area where they can lead. And China's industrial might was historically built on taking Western manufacturing processes, copying them, making them cheaper, and then having the manufacturing transferred to China, and then selling those goods back to the West, and then because they could do it much more cheaply. This is the first sort of industrial revolution where China wants to lead it, and where they're investing in the technology, they're investing in the innovation. So we should be in no doubt that they can be a really important part of trying to drive this forward. And I think with the way in which the UAE will handle them, then they can be brought to the table for November and they can make a very important contribution. Russia, I think, is much more difficult. That the UAE clearly has a different relationship with Russia than we do in the West. That it'll be, I think, up to Russia whether they wish to take part. And I think that if they do, then we have to some extent, recognize that they will have a contribution to make in tackling climate change, and we have to try and separate that out from everything else. Because at the end of the day, these will be negotiations about climate change rather than negotiations about how you end a war or how you deal with reparations afterwards. There are areas where they can make a useful contribution. Their nuclear expertise had been very good. I mean, I have a real question in my mind, given the terrible regard which they've taken to nuclear safety in Ukraine and the direct threat they pose to Ukrainian nuclear plants, whether they are a fit nation to have a state-owned nuclear company building nuclear plants. But historically, they've had a big contribution to make in some of those areas. So I think we have to be optimistic. I think if you don't start this journey optimistic, then if you aim low, you will succeed low. And if we want to make a significant change, then we have to aim high. But we also have to recognize that this is something where if we don't all collectively pull together globally, north, south, east, west, then we're not going to deliver. And then we will then face the backlash from populations. Because already populations are seeing the consequences of catastrophic climate change. And we'll see it from our electorates. If you look and see what happened in Australia, where a government tried to get re-elected on a essentially climate denial agenda, then it was swept out of office. And I think one of the changes which we've seen in most of Europe is that all governments are now broadly aligned. And maybe there's something which we can do to help the US in that regard. I don't want to be sort of British patronizing, we can help sort your problems out. But in most of Europe, climate change has been taken out of politics. And both sides of the debate, left and right, agree on the need for action. And in the US, you haven't got that sense of unanimity so far. But I think if we want to make progress, trying to secure that is an important part of the process.
Great, thank you. Let me go back to ask a question. It really relates to the last panel that was up just now in the plenary, and that is there was a bit of a debate in that about whether renewable energy is cheaper in Africa, or be cheaper in the developing world, or whether the capital costs and the risk in the developing world prevent that from happening. In other words, if you have to charge 15% interest in the developing world and 0 in the developed world, you don't get the same benefit from renewable energy. My question is to Neil, you should take the lead on this, is what can we do, and it's an international issue, that's why I raise it, what can we do to figure out how to get finance to the developing world? I mean, there's a pretty good argument that renewable energy is in fact cheaper even in those countries in the abstract. But if you can't get the financing to do it, it's not cheaper. And there are a lot of other costs between the cost of manufacturing and the cost of delivery. So give me your views on what the international community can do to address this issue.
Yeah. So the first thing that has to happen is that we have to not talk about Africa. We have to not talk about emerging markets. There's so much variation. And what is not bankable in, I don't know, Chad or Central African Republic could be bankable in Egypt or South Africa, right? Brazil, still referred to, at least on indexes, as an emerging market, one of the most robust markets for renewables in the world, right? Second is that we also have to disaggregate what we're investing in solar, renewable, wind, terrestrial wind, I mean, very low cost, known technology, basically no technology risk. Some parts of the world a little bit dusty, so that presents some challenges, et cetera, but there's solutions. Green hydrogen, completely different kind of thing, not bankable, right? Not a commercial project, needs a lot of aid to work. All of these things can sort of fit in the emerging market solution. Somebody can disagree with me if they want. The reason that, so let's take Africa broadly, maybe excluding a couple of the bigger countries like South Africa, Kenya. The reason that capital is not there for climate is the same reason capital is not there for anything, right? Poor governance, weak rule of law, and by the way, governance in many of the countries going backward, weak rule of law, lack of projects, extremely high barriers to entry, economies that are dominated by state-owned enterprises or a few big family groups that do not want competition. They don't want to innovate. They have their empires. Why worry about growth and efficiency? And by the way, a lot of governments don't really want that to happen either, because efficiency also comes from sometimes rationalizing employees, i.e. not as high of employment, and that's a problem, right? To Charles's point on the politics of something. So just throwing money at the problem is not going to fix it. It has to be a more holistic solution. Now, the counter to what I just said, of course, is we can't wait. Well, in most of the countries, let's keep in mind, like, it's actually electrification, actually accessing power that's most important, right? And, you know, obviously we don't want to be investing in a bunch of big coal plants and that kind of stuff that's super polluting. But let's be realistic. The real emissions issue is in the developed world and in China. So let's not begrudge countries, leaders, who are trying to provide economic development, access to education, healthcare, et cetera, that all requires power. Let's not begrudge them, right? Let's not begrudge them investment in gas that can form a new industrial base so they can provide jobs, build a tax base so that they can also then invest in their own economies. But unfortunately, you have a number of development organizations and, by the way, the US government that still largely prohibit those kinds of investments. So that kind of stuff has to change because we have to marry. Remember, I'll stop because I think I'm talking too long. Sustainability, the energy transition rests on the bedrock of energy security, reliability, and affordability. If you don't have that, you're not going to get the transition because the transition still requires political will, which goes back to Charles's point. It all goes back to domestic politics. Same is true in the US, UK, South Africa, even China. You don't have to be a democratic system for that reality to be the truth. And so those are the issues you have to start to address.
May I just add one sentence? I fully agree, and I couldn't say it better. Let me just, an anecdote. It was said about Mozambique. 14 years, okay, but 14 years, the same difficulties would be if Mozambique wants to finance anything without the support of the IFIs. And as Neil has very well said, the IFIs had a definitive just no to anything that is not renewable in the global south. Mozambique is selling today, and they have reached agreements with Germany, the cleaner of the cleanest. This gas from Mozambique goes where? To generate power, electricity in Germany. But the Mozambicans just ask for money or for contribution or for just to use their same gas into just powering. As we say, we need base load. Today, this leapfrog to directly, you are happy the same way that you went to, that we teach. I have been on panels in Africa where a German colleague, and I remember this one, just would say, you, in fact, you know what? You are privileged. You are going to jump directly to the renewables, the same way that you jump directly in the telephone. Yes, but there is a big difference. The renewables today do not make the trick. And the first thing that we should take is the decision to change these rules. And as it was said by Amadou, the envoy, the Senegalese envoy, we need not just it's to make good conditions for financing. For financing, if Mozambique has gas, of course, we need to make good conditions to finance that. And until we do that, we will not be credible. You have said the word. I said trust, but it's better credibility. We are not credible, as simple as that.
Ken, if I may just jump in on this, I think, Neil, you've well articulated, and I took away several points that I think are very important on this question. One is you mentioned a whole kind of approach. Not whole of government approach, but one that takes into account all of the elements that you've mentioned. And values were mentioned here. Anna earlier in her own comment mentioned the importance of values. If you don't have the kind of infrastructure, that's what's also, and rule of law, transparency, you were describing all the different kinds of elements that have been a kind of deterrent and haven't been an incentive. But I think you're right in saying that that doesn't mean that one can't try. Sure. And this isn't really the best kind of comparison, But I will say this, that when I looked at the time that the HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria fund was established at the UN, there was a very concerted effort in a targeted area of Africa, just southern Africa, to go after and try to eradicate malaria. And the effort was targeted. Again, that's not, this is more complicated, but there was a buy-in from the countries and resources were provided. And quite frankly, where you see it before and where you see it now, it's totally different, because it wasn't just only about giving charitable aid up front, but it was also about the countries being vested in the solution and also seeing the benefit for them politically because of the results for the people on the ground. And the people on the ground, the rate of malaria, has gone down exponentially. So I think you're right. I support what he says. I think that he's right in saying it, and that one should be optimistic, to use your term, and look at those kinds of paths and ways forward.
Great, thank you, Charles.
There's certainly 1 billion, probably better closer to 2 billion people on the planet who have no access to energy, that they heat and they get any warmth from scavenging for wood and burning it. Those are people who, if we have a humanitarian approach towards climate change, that will want to have access to power over time. That as we look out to 2050, demand for energy will probably double, demand for electricity will probably treble. And I question whether the solution for that in sub-Saharan Africa and in parts of Asia is large power stations costing hundreds of millions of pounds with a grid infrastructure costing billions of pounds. That might be right for cities, but for many more remote areas, the solution needs to be more decentralized. And that by going down that route, which is much, much more affordable, a lot of it can be done through different channels rather than traditional financing mechanisms, that you bring refrigeration so food can be kept, you bring refrigeration for medicine, you bring the ability for lighting so schools can be kept open, you bring electricity for businesses, you bring electricity for hospitals. And so that you can then have an enormous humanitarian change on those communities by doing it in a much more decentralized way. And a slight aside to that, it's a phenomenal democratizer. In many parts of the world, people are dependent on global energy companies or big energy companies controlled by a few individuals or on governments for the energy which they have. By moving in this decentralized way, you transfer that power from big business and from big government to individuals and communities and small businesses. And it's a phenomenal change, which actually means that they can be much more in control of their lives than ever before. So whilst I recognize that all the challenges which Neil sets out for large-scale energy investment in those areas, then let's not rule out the fact that there's an enormous amount of change and progress which can be made, which has a very strong humanitarian feel to it as well, by looking at a more decentralized solution.
And you also used earlier, there isn't a cookie-cutter approach, and there shouldn't be a kind of cookie-cutter approach. And I think on this issue, even looking at the continent of Africa, you can't have a cookie-cutter approach.
Can I give actually two discrete ideas?
Sure.
One of them is you have to start giving finance firms and big corporations a financial incentive to put capital into those countries. So they started to get at this in COP in Sharm el-Sheikh with, I don't know whether Secretary Kerry's idea is correct or not, but that's the kind of thing that needs to happen. So you're buying down the cost. You're basically moving money from their home jurisdiction to the target countries. The second is we need to stop relying on one-off projects like the DFC looks at or like the World Bank looks at. Money managers, whether they're private like me, like my firm, or banks, they know how to move large pools of capital, and that's what needs to happen. So what you have to do is shift these mechanisms to funds or other kinds of vehicles that the private sector is deploying with their know-how, technology, and speed.
Great. People will stick with us for a minute. We're really getting over the time limit, but there's one other critical area I wanted to talk about as far as under this issue, and that is the question of trade disputes. Countries around the world, certainly the United States, is becoming much more protectionist than it was a number of years ago, and you're seeing tensions beginning to rise on that now. The United States, in the Inflation Reduction Act, has provisions that benefit U.S. industries at the expense of imports. Europe is now considering border taxes including on steel, which I don't think they're in effect yet, but they're about to come into effect, which will have the same impact as far as an issue creating tension going forward. And there are issues, national security issues relating to giving technology to a place like China that are relevant too, although we won't talk about those now. But my question is, how do we, again, make sure those tensions don't undercut the fundamental effort of the climate effort, which is to get everybody to reduce emissions and get the North to help the South adapt and deal with the economic impact of climate change. So I just wanted to ask people's thoughts on how can you separate those issues in these negotiations, or to what extent can you separate those issues in these negotiations?
Well, if I may, let's not forget that Paris is not legally binding. It's not a treaty. It's not international law. It's just self-proclaimed and self-taken obligations by member states. I think that we cannot go backwards. The happy globalization is done. This is as simple as that. Just supply chains will be different, and we need to build this new world with, I fully agree, and I think that this is one issue that is extremely important. We need to have cooperation with China, but let's be clear, we are going to a world where in certain areas, and we have to define these areas, fully agree with you, in certain areas, there will be two systems, and the CHIPS Act goes into that direction. So, by the way, United States has just stopped the functioning of the panel resolution mechanism of the WTO, and this is not yesterday. So all this, what the war in Ukraine and to a great extent the COVID has done is to just precipitate processes that were there. You mentioned this idea that we are in a moment of populisms, and that the populisms tend to look inwards, even if this doesn't make sense, or at least it doesn't make sense for me. But as I say, we are in a different world. We have to just build the new one, and the sooner the better.
I wanted to join in on this because as you were asking the question, I was going to go back to an older COP, and when Indonesia chaired the COP, and it was Bali. And I don't know how many of you remember the fact, but I really remember this. I thought it was very innovative of the Indonesians. And by the way, it reminds me in the sense of preparation here with the UAE. I totally agree. I was very impressed at the speech this morning, the preparation, the focus, the game plan, and I have expectations of what will be the outcome. But the Indonesians, in preparation for Bali, really took a lot of time and effort, and I remember this by being in government at the time. They circulated around, and they did a lot of diplomacy. And Ken, you know what one of their initiatives was? At the COP, they held a meeting of trade ministers and also finance ministers. And the trade ministers, the mandate was to discuss environmental goods and services and which ones would not be taxed. Okay, the finance ministers didn't have as much success, admittedly, but interestingly enough, I don't know how many people remember this, but there was a document that came out of the Bali conference, and in which there actually was a document, the US, Europe, many other countries signed it, saying that we support these, and forgive me, the number may have been about 36 or 40 environmental goods and services. It came off the World Bank list, and there was a grand announcement, and the Indonesians got quite a bit of credit. So that's the good news, but guess what happened after that? Brazil killed it. And Brazil killed it because they wanted to have on that list sugarcane, you know, relative to the Brazilian energy source. So I think there's room here for creative actions and ideas, but, you know, one hopes that there isn't an interjection of kind of a spoiler at the end that can kill an opportunity.
Great, Charles.
It doesn't really make sense to me that we measure carbon by where it's manufactured rather than where it's consumed. And it seems to me that if you look at the UK's achievements, we've been able to decarbonise more than almost any other country in our Kyoto commitments. We've reduced our carbon emissions by 40% over that time, whilst we've grown the economy by 70%. But that was fundamentally by shifting from coal to gas, and also by offshoring so much of our manufacturing. So we're still consuming those goods, but we're just not manufacturing them. And it seems to me that in a fair world, you need to measure it according to where the consumption is. Now, once that happens, then you've got to have mechanisms, and I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism is probably the most complicated thing I've ever tried to get my head around. But we need to make progress. But I think what we're also seeing is that business itself, and the pressure on business to deliver on its Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 commitments, means that they are pushing for parts of their manufacturing processes to know that they've been done in a more low-carbon way, because they now have to account for it. And so they are saying they want greater transparency, and they want to have greater certainty about what's going on. And in many areas, there's an acceptance that they may have to pay a higher price in order to have that clarity and certainty. Picking up on Anna's point about where I think the next supply chain crisis comes from, which is our massive over-reliance on Asia, and particularly China, for the parts for the EV, for parts for the renewable energy sector. Almost all of the lithium chemicals comes from China. The European electrical vehicle manufacturers want that manufacturing in Europe because they want the transparency, they want to know about the employment rights, they want to know how it's being done. And they say, look, having it conveniently nearby and with that transparency is a premium product. They're prepared to pay more for it. And that also plays into the security of supply agenda, which I think has gained so much importance. I think in order to deliver on security of supply, we have to recognize that the globalization, as Anna says, has reached its limits. We have to row back on that. We have to do more in Europe. The IRA and the US will absolutely deliver on that, but it will come at a price.
Great. Well, we'll ask one. I'll let Neil comment on this and end the discussion. There are other areas we could have covered, including mineral shortages and how they affect negotiations. But Neil, any more comments on this issue, and then we'll go from there.
Very briefly, I think any economist would tell you that a global carbon tax would be the most economically efficient way to deal with an externality like climate change. That is impossible, of course. So a carbon tariff is a way to backdoor a carbon tax. Unfortunately for me, who actually believes that free trade is objectively improves the whole, that's not where the politics are in the U.S. right now. And so if I were the Biden administration, I'd be trying to go big. I'd be reaching out to the far-right, more protectionist Republicans who don't like free trade, squish them together with my environmental community, and I would be trying to merge the massive, the two of three largest demand markets in the world, the EU, maybe the UK will come along, the US, and if you do that in a common carbon border adjustment scheme, you will force a global carbon price for any country that wants to access those markets, and all of them do, including China.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists. I think they did a great job. I have two very brief announcements, which is just to remind people that at 7 o'clock tonight there is a beach party and dinner. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but it's right
On the beach.
I know it's the beach here. I just don't know how to get there. Do you know?
Take the elevator to the 3rd floor, and then across, you take the tunnel under towards the beach.
Great. Thank you. And then the last thing is at 9:30, there's one more session. Anybody who has the energy to do it, night owl session on, again, dealing, I think, with Russia after the war is the context of it. So again, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the panelists. I think it was a great panel. We could have gone on for another hour, but my colleagues here won't let me do that. So thank you all very much.